What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Tsunade turned Naruto into a girl? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. Naruto blinked, unable to see in the blinding light that surrounded him. All he knew was the light. It seemed to be everywhere, and there was nothing else here to see. All he could remember since waking up was a long journey and a powerful urge. An urge he couldn't fathom. He had been doing something, but the light seemed to have stolen it away. All he could feel was the liquid dripping onto his head. Futilely he attempted to block it. However, it seemed to miss his hands each time, straight on the head. What is your desire? Naruto blinked, looking around trying to find the source of the noise. The sound filling his ears, almost booming in his head. It was a voice he had heard before. It was definitely male, he could tell that, but he couldn't place the name. Power? Naruto's mind was assaulted with images of a ruined Konoha beneath his feet. The dead piled before him. He was completely unscathed. His body was strong and his visage was one of a powerful conqueror. It had taken only minutes to wipe out the village of his birth. The sight made his stomach turn. The only path to such power, it was unholy. It was the Kyuubi. This voice, it wasn't the demons. It was someone else. Wealth? Naruto again saw images of himself having collected the bounty of some man that he had never even heard of. The amount was astronomical. It had even been an easy job. He smiled as he looked at the money and calmly whistled, walking away towards the next bounty without a care. It wasn't right to him, caring only about his wallet. Women? Naruto once again saw himself. This time in a bed, happy as he looked to the four girls around him cooing for his affections. However, there was something wrong about it. He could make out Sakura, and her blonde friend Ino, Hinata, and the crazy snake Jonin, Anko. They each had a metal band on their necks and their eyes were glossy and blank. It shocked him as he realized they were being controlled. It was easy once you noticed the toneless edge to their voices. He was so sick he almost lost it. It was horrible and disturbing. He believed in freedom. No? Of course not, you're too noble. Fine, if you cannot be bought. Naruto blinked into the white void as a shadow appeared, slowly wavering into existence. The man was tall, lean, and handsome with dark hair and dark eyes. His skin was pale. He was obviously in his 20s or 30s and wore a headband Naruto had never seen before. But if Naruto had to guess, he looked very similar to an older Sasuke. That reminded him, the last thing he had done before the white had clouded his vision was fight Sasuke on the rooftops of the hospital. Kakashi-sensei had stopped it, but he couldn't remember much afterward. Then I will have to punish you, Naruto, the Sasuke look-alike muttered, annoyed. His eyes narrowing as a flash of red lit the grim man's eyes for only a second before Naruto crumpled to his knees, agony filling every inch of his body. I will punish you in a way you couldn't even fathom, but should you join me, all those things could be yours. The idea of him actually agreeing to allow those things made him feel even worse as he weakly snarled. I figured, you are an idealist. He seemed to be thinking back almost fondly before the pain grew. Naruto could only clench up into the fetal position to try to resist crying out. This is punishment for denying me here and ruining everything there. It took me 3 years to finish this jutsu. It might be a one-shot, but it is worth it. Sasuke sneered darkly, you will never get the chance. Naruto couldn't hear the rest, but he heard it in his soul. Whatever tortures he visited upon him could only be removed by falling into the darkness that he had already embraced, or live the rest of his life in the newfound torment. Naruto's choice was a simple one. Shadow of intent. Disclaimer. I don't own Naruto. Tsunade sighed as she spoke with Kakashi in front of her patient's door. She couldn't believe their immaturity, but it was undeniable. Sasuke and Naruto were rivals in a time of peace. They had nothing but themselves to prove. No war to propel them to their limits, and missions were only now beginning to allow them any action or test of their, rather exceptional, skills. However, using such dangerous techniques on comrades was unacceptable. Tsunade's eyes glanced to the door and frowned. Kakashi also mentioned that Naruto had collapsed just a flight of stairs down from the roof. It didn't take long to get him here in a hospital room. What bothered her was the cause of his collapse. No jutsu she knew of could cause these symptoms, and poisons, well, those had different signs altogether. Let's take a look, shall we? She asked calmly, as she walked into the room. She was surprised twofold by what she saw when she walked in. One, the patient was awake, which was definitely a good thing all things considered, but it was the second thing that bothered her greatly. She was looking at a bare-topped, long-haired, blonde female. She did a double take and checked her charts and the room number. She looked at Kakashi, who was replacing his headband, shock easily noticeable on the Junin's stature as he nodded. Naruto? Tsunade ventured, causing the poor girl to jump out of bed, frightened and slipping to the floor unbalanced, with a loud thud dragging some of the medical equipment with her, the medical gown hanging on her hips. Suddenly a memory slapped her in the face from her sensei's reports and her temper flared. Stop that perverted jutsu and stand up. She demanded, annoyed and snarling as Kakashi snickered, not having thought of that. Biba-chan? Her voice was soft and obviously female, as Tsunade looked down at the boy in annoyance before he quickly gave a nod out of sheer fear and muttered aloud, Kai. What Tsunade saw shocked her more than the previous sight was the one forming before her. Before, the girl was scrawny and thin female obviously, but could have passed for a boy with clothes and such, almost like she was incomplete. Now there was a much longer-haired, bigger-eyed girl. There was no way to hide that. Be more mature. As she grabbed Naruto's head and channeled chakra to dispel him back to a boy, however the resounding poof shocked her again. Now there was an even more radiant and busty 15-year-old girl pouting up at the Hokage and shaking her head, almost frightened. Biba-chan, stop. Tsunade rubbed her eyes as she looked at the scene before her and looked back to Kakashi, who had wisely turned around and was looking at the wall with great interest. What happened here, Hitaki? Tsunade asked calmly. The elite Jonin shrugged and made the hand sign for no information. This meant that this was more recent of a development. The fifth Hokage looked down at Naruto. Explain. Naruto blinked her eyes at the Hokage and shook her head. I don't know. She whined. You could almost hear the tears in her voice. I woke up. I thought I had somehow changed into Hedge in my sleep and tried to dispel it to change back, but instead, I dunno, it became harder to remember boy things and stuff. I know how to be a ninja, but each time I try to change back, I become more girl looking and stuff. She tried to explain as best he could, but Tsunade already knew this was Jiraiya's territory. Tsunade also noted that Naruto was slowly changing back into something other than the form she was in at the moment, like she wasn't completely finished. Tsunade decided to wait, having Naruto sit on the bed while Tsunade gave her the works. She noticed that Naruto seemed to be stabilizing into a finalized state, at least until they could turn her back into a him. Tsunade decided to give her a full medical while this was going on. Naruto sighed as she leaned back into her bed. Her hospital gown fastened around her waist, her eyes were puffy and red. She absently rubbed a single red hand-shaped mark on her cheek, and more tears fell slowly. They continued to fall, no matter how much she wanted them to stop. She was strong. This shouldn't happen. It doesn't make sense. It was depressing even to think on. Her mind flitted back to before she was a girl, and she frowned remembering her bits of a dream. It was so blurry. It seemed important, but she couldn't remember why. All she knew was that it was weird. Different. Then there was the past. Parts of it seemed to be changing in her head. She could remember some things clearly as a boy, but some things she remembered that she knew never happened. Her first period was a big one. Definitely didn't happen, and she really wished the details weren't at all clear, which of course they were. Then there were some things that made no sense. She remembered the Haku complimenting on her figure and grace as a kunoichi in the forest, but then she was a guy fighting Zabuza. Arg! She moaned in pain as she held her head, shivering, trying to sort out her life. It was like trying to pick apart the differences between ants. After a pain-filled few minutes, she decided to just lay back. It was less stressful. She rubbed her cheek and sighed solemnly, shaking her head as she remembered the interaction with Hinata just minutes before. It was a strange moment in her life, to be sure. Panic causes problems. However, she also couldn't help but lick her lips, and smiling a bit as well. Shadow of intent. Naru panted heavily as she ran into the training ground and looked around, seeing no one else. She let out a quiet sigh and then fell down tiredly. She just wasn't used to running around yet, as she relaxed against a nearby tree and yawned a bit as she tried to see her private sensei, but seeing no one, she decided a quick nap wouldn't hurt too much. However, above her, the shadow watching over her was waiting for this moment exactly as it crept closer and closer. Naru gasped as she was pressed to the tree violently, a kunai pressed to her throat and a hand choking the air out of her. She couldn't even gasp as a voice whispered into her ear in a cold, feminine voice. "You're dead. Or worse." Then moved back, letting the blonde genin breath for a moment. Then Naru looked up, still a bit winded from the strong grasp, and blinked, recognizing the shape. Her long tanned trench coat and fish wire shirt, mixed with spiky hair and gray-blue eyes. Naru's eyes widened as she recognized the woman and pointed at her in shock. "Why, you're that crazy snake lady," Naru exclaimed as Anko smiled, almost pleased to have left such an impression. "You've changed a bit since I last saw you, Gaki. Did you grow out your hair?" Anko teased and Naru growled as she stood up, brushing herself off. She opened her mouth to retort when she felt a pair of arms slip up her shirt and grope her from behind. She shrieked as she attempted to get free, only to hear Anko's laughs in her ear. Too slow, too unaware, as she saw the Anko ahead dissipate into a puff of smoke. Naru let out a small groan at Anko's advance as she continued to grope the younger girl. "You're too easy, Naruto, you're a target," she whispered as Naru attempted to regain her footing against the snake user. Anko once again moved suddenly and Naru gasped a relieved breath. As a kunoichi, facing death is even more of a danger should you survive to be captured, she said in a cool, serious voice, and then she moved forward with a quick pace towards the frightened blonde, who barely had time to cower from the special Jonin's assault. After a moment of no contact, she looked up to see the back of a Jonin uniform. She also recognized the silver hair of her first genin sensei, Kakashi. Now Anko, she's been a girl less than a week. How about we train her first?" Anko seemed annoyed by the interference but nodded. "You're the senior trainer here, senpai." Anko looked past him and smiled mischievously, even as the silver-hair Cyclops looked Naru over and then raised a single hand as Anko smiled at being able to do the introduction. "Well then, Gaki, we are your special trainers, skilled Jonins pulled from other assignments to better you as a shinobi of this village. I am Mitarashi Anko, and this is, as you should remember, Hitaki Kakashi." Naru nodded and smiled at her old sensei. "First off, Naru, I wanted to get a read on how your chakra flow is now that you have changed." Naru nodded and tilted her head curiously as Anko looked at Kakashi and signed something. She blinked at the response. Shinobi signs were basic, simple movements made to convey concepts more than actually words. They were also made to be only understandable to those trained in them. "Ready, when you are, sensei," he nodded and then smiled. 50 shadow clones. Anko looked at Kakashi in almost complete shock. She'd seen the Gaki use at most 20 during the exams, but at Naru's excited nod, she kept her mouth shut. Then in a moment they were surrounded by an army much larger than 50. Kakashi seemed annoyed while Anko was in shock, to say the least of it. "This would kill most people outright. I said 50. Kakashi scolded, but Naru was confused. "This is the same amount of chakra I used to make 50 clones, though." She too was amazed by the sheer number of clones that surrounded them. Kakashi sighed and looked back before giving one of his eye smiles and chuckling. "Over 500. Naru and Anko were astounded by the number of clones as Kakashi continued. Obviously this conversion has increased Naru's skill with her chakra control immensely, without drastically reducing her overall chakra. "Interesting." Kakashi nodded as if thinking on his own. Anko however looked down at Naru and smiled. "Wow, Gaki, if this doesn't even tire you out." Anko seemed almost entertained as Kakashi looked down to Naru. "Have you been using this to your full potential?" Kakashi finally thought he'd found how Naru had been advancing so quickly. "Full potential? You mean using more clones?" Naru asked, confused even as Kakashi blinked. "You know the memories, Gaki. The knowledge." Anko pushed, but Naru seemed more confused and Kakashi broke in. "Naru, have you ever noticed that you always know what your clones know? Even if they aren't with you?" Naru blinked and almost shook her head no, before nodding vigorously, remembering the chase of Ebisu just prior to the Chunin exams. Kakashi smiled at his own student's ignorance and pulled out 2 scrolls. "I want you to have half of your clones read one scroll and the rest read the other. Then practice them." Naru blinked and nodded as her clones took the scrolls and began to work on them. Anko however smiled as she could tell what would come next. Physical training, her favorite. Tenten's apartment. Tenten yawned as she sat up and looked around for Naru, not finding her nearby or anywhere. She sighed. Then she noticed a piece of paper on the table. She looked over to it and smiled. Naru had to leave for training and would come back later to talk about last night. Tenten smiled and folded the paper and put it away. She hummed a quiet song as she moved to opening her door to go get some breakfast and remembered to grab her pouch and opened the door to see her teammate Neji standing in front of her. "Hi Neji-kun." However, the young Hyuga seemed annoyed as he looked down at her and shook his head. Tenten was confused for a moment before the young genin spoke. "Tenten, you disgust me. Stay away from my team." Then without another word he walked away, leaving her shocked as she collapsed against the door, in shock. Tears began to fall from her eyes as she thought about everything. And her mind locked on the only reason that Neji would say such a thing. Naru told someone. Tenten growled in a sad but furious tone and prepared to get revenge. She quickly continued towards the supermarket to get her breakfast, and when Naru returned, they would talk all right, maybe with a few sharp implements between them. Team Guide Training Ground. "Yash, Neji tilde was our young Tenten unwell? I see that she didn't come along with you," Guy stated loudly from on top of a log. It had the scars of rough practice from when Lee would use it. However, the younger version of the green beast was still in the hospital. Neji's expression was sour and his sensei didn't improve it. "I also see you still carry the scroll I gave you to deliver last night to her. Did something happen?" Guy's voice held a bit of worry and paranoia. Common traits since Lee's injuries. "No, ninja like her will not be joining us. Ever." Neji's cold tone surprised Guy, who jumped down in front of Neji and raised one of his large eyebrows. "What do you mean? Did she quit?" Guy seemed bothered even as Neji shook his head and looked to his sensei like he was about to spill a dark secret. "Sensei, I saw her with another woman, together. Last night, kissing." Guy blinked a bit before tilting his head, as was unsurprising of the eccentric Might Guy. He didn't understand the traditional view Neji was attempting to use to conjure the problem to his sensei. "She's gay sensei, I saw it with my Byakugan, it was disgusting." Then at Guy's shocked silence, Neji glared and shook his head before walking away from even his sensei. Guy on the other hand recovered and silently vowed in his own dramatic fashion, "I must fix this." Yash tilde. Hidden Lair Sound Compound. Kabuto slipped into his master's room and smiled slightly at the sight of the agonized Sannin, although Kabuto knew that his master could still kill him with less than a thought. He still found the sounds endearing to hear. As he looked over at the broken man he bowed and shook his head. "I am sorry, Orochimaru-sama. No other doctors are willing to meet you after the last. No one has delivered a cure. It would seem we'll have to move up the plan, as you thought. I'll send out the sound for." However, Orochimaru hacked and sneered darkly, his snake-like eyes locking with Kabuto's, and the medic flinched. "No, I can hold out a bit more. If we do it too early, we'll lose him, and I need that body. Instead, we'll move on to looking for a backup. If this body lasts the month, then we will go collect the Uchiha." The snake Sannin smiled at his trusted medic and Kabuto nodded, before turning to the wall and marking something. "Counting down from now. Anything else?" Orochimaru sneered and nodded darkly, his sneer gone and eyes dark. "Give Project 33, a bit of my special compound 17. See if that does the trick." Kabuto's eyes widened and it all made sense now. Even if it worked, the recovery time of someone taking the compound was a month. So sneaky. The medic nin nodded and slipped out and left his master to his agonies. This was the beginning, he knew. It would be glorious. Outside Tenten's apartment, Naru sighed as she walked up the steps to her friend's home. Her legs trembled slightly as she walked off the pain of her training today. Her head was pounding as she had learned the dangers of dismissing too many clones at once. But what she had gained was worth it. Her balance was already better. If you don't outrun Anko's special dodge assistants, training you end up a pincushion. Then came the fact that she was already better at her old tricks than she was before. Soon she'd practice a one-handed Rasengan. However, there were downsides to her training. She had to deal with Anko's bile pranks during, before and after training, although it was incentive not to screw up. But then there was sheer brutality. She hoped she would improve from all of this. What could happen that would be so bad? Naru smiled as she opened the unlocked door and stepped in tiredly. "Hey Tilda. Tenten-chan, I am back," she called out only to feel her feet dragged out from under her and fell back with an audible gasp of pain. Her vision swam for a moment before she heard the door slam, and then darkness, like a cloth bag, wrapped her as she struggled for a moment before she was swaying back and forth. She was screaming in fear for her friend as she attempted to escape her captor. Her hand swung out and she tried to grab onto something, but instead she was bound by her arm to the ceiling, and then the other arm was taken, and Naru realized what could be worse. Capture. A moment ago she realized she could have escaped using the cage bushin. Now she was trapped completely. Then she felt her captor's hands on her waist, as she attempted to kick them off, until a deft move later she was left clenching her legs together, hiding herself and holding her pants with her ankles. Then the hands began to roam her body, rough and violently, as she screamed frightened until the cloth was gone and the hands had left her. She was looking over to the blurry figure in the bright light, and her eyes widened at the sight of the long brown-haired shape before her, and blinked, recognizing it as Tenten. Tenten-chan, why? But the kind friend was missing, and an angry one was there instead. Obviously her anger had cooled to a dark rage. Then the kunoichi walked over and with a hard look made Naru go silent. You betrayed me. Now, Naru-chan, I will make you pay. As she tilted her head to look in Naru's eyes, Naru shivered as a feeling of deep abysmal fear struck her, and she felt a rough kiss and even rougher hands explore her, and for the first time, Naru understood. This is dangerous. I will make you moan. I will make you cry. I will make you feel how I do. Naru could see the tears of pain in her friend's eyes as she weakly struggled, and then a shiver went up her spine. The world seemed to darken a bit. A silent scream died in her throat as a shadow appeared in her vision, and she froze, unable to struggle, unable to speak, as it drew closer. Drip, drip, drip. A silent training ground. To most it would appear to be nothing more than a clearing with a stream running through it. A silent breeze flows through the area, jostling a pair of leaves from the trees. As they slowly tumbled to the ground, the silence was broken by the sound of a pair of feet. A moment before they touched the grassy earth, the leaves were left as obliterated shreds. A dark-haired young man with milky blue-gray eyes looked up at the tree line, annoyed. A dark frown set on his face as he took his traditional combat stance. Come out, Neji declared brazenly. A moment later, a blue-clad shinobi with the symbol of the Uchiha clan on his back landed nearly soundlessly across the clearing, a dint of casual violence in his eyes as he surveyed the Hyuga opposite himself and then chuckled. You are the previous year's top rookie? Pathetic. Sasuke jeered with a grim smirk as Neji's usual cool mind burned, already in an unbalanced state of mind, as a small cloud of leaves fell behind the Uchiha, who only smirked as they exploded into shreds. His cold black eyes staring into the genin across from him. Bring it, weakling. Neji charged, his Byakugan activating as he moved in, a pair of gentle fist strikes aimed straight at Sasuke's chest. The Uchiha merely spun away from the strike with an almost dancing motion as he stabbed at Neji's hands with a once concealed kunai. Both young prodigies leapt back, realizing the other's intent, and then moved in again. However, Sasuke slipped into Neji's guard using his own bloodline and kneed the Hyuga firmly in the solar plexus, causing the long-haired boy to gasp as Sasuke muttered, "If I was trying to kill you, you'd have just died. You are better than this. Fight me again when you're not so weak." Then the Uchiha slammed his knee up again and walked away. Neji collapsed, gasping for air, grasping at his escaped foe from the ground, wondering how his foe had become so fast, or himself had become so slow. Damn you. Shadow of intent. Disclaimer. I don't own Naruto. Sakura sighed as she looked up at her temporary sensei, Ebisu. While he was good at teaching her some of the basics, he was a rather bland guy. She sighed as she looked around for her teammates. Sasuke had skipped training and Naruto had literally disappeared without a word. It was strange. She grumbled even louder as she walked into her best friend and rival, Ino Yamanaka. Hey, Ino pig, where's your team? Ino turned and smiled widely before giggling. Oh, Sakura, they're right here. Then she moved over and revealed a pair of annoyed shinobi dressed up in obviously different clothes than usual. They looked like girls. Sakura almost doubled over as she looked to Ino, who smirked. They lost a bet. Poor boys. Shikamaru grumbled about something under his breath. Choji, however, seemed to ignore it and continue his happy munching. Sakura smiled and shook her head as she looked back at her friend. Have you seen Sasuke or Naruto lately? She asked, and Ino blinked before shaking her head and shrugging. Sakura groaned in annoyance and sighed. Damn, they're leaving me behind all the time. I have to go, see you later Ino. The blonde nodded and waved off her teammates as she moved to follow her best friend. She was bored and in the very least she could see Sasuke. Tenten's apartment. Naru made a small sound as she felt Tenten's hands pressing into her, and widening within her. Each movement and stroke making Naru lean her head back and tears to fall even as she felt her body heating up at the brutal touches of her own friend. Then she felt the burns of leather against her flesh, and she groaned. Something kept her from speaking loud or even making a sound louder than a moan. Tenten looked at Naru and almost yelled, "Why don't you speak up? Tell me, damn it, you were my friend, but you turned around and betrayed me. My own team hates me. And it's your fault." Then she turned away and pulled out a few things. Naru groaned as she tried to talk but her throat felt raw even as she did. And then Tenten walked around behind her and whispered into her ear. "Ready? I'll show you the true wrath of a woman's scorn." Then Naru's world exploded as something pressed into her slightly, and tears fell from her eyes and sobs racked her body. She was afraid and helpless. "Tenten, my wondrous student. You must stop this most unyouthful action." The loud domineering voice of Might Guy broke the moment and Naru let out a gasp as Tenten pulled away and Naru felt like she could breathe again. Something was definitely wrong. This is not the actions of my most youthful student. Genjutsu Kai. The Jonin called as he touched Tenten and she collapsed to her knees, shaking as she coughed a tearful wail and hugged her sensei's legs terrified. Naru however slumped to the floor as the chains exploded into bits at the force of a single airstrike from the mighty Jonin. Literally punching the air to shatter chains. Sensei, I don't know why, I just couldn't stop, so angry, hateful, scared, and Neji said. However, the soft touch of Guy's hand made her cries stop as she looked up to the serious face of her usually goofy sensei. Tenten, please, go get dressed. I will talk with your friend. Tenten scurried off to get some clothes and to hide from him and Naru. She couldn't express what she was feeling. However, Guy looked over the golden-haired girl and sighed as he pressed a hand to her back and sighed calmly. Can you sit? I feel I need to answer for my student. A warm feeling filled the young blonde as the strange Jonin touched her as she turned pulling her shirt down a bit to cover herself a bit more, before turning to look at him. Hi, Guy-sensei, she said in a quiet tone, her voice a bit shaky. Guy blinked and remembered his rival mentioning a new student. A blonde girl. Obvious Kakashi had mentioned him to the girl. After all she fit the description to a T. Naru's eyes were teary still at the near invasion and the complete loss of control she suffered. I can't say I approve of her reaction but I know what caused it. Last night I asked one of my less youthful students, Neji, to deliver a message to Tenten last night. I suppose when he received no response, he decided to check if she was even here. That was when he saw you and her together. You see, Neji's family is extremely traditional, and he took it as a personal affront to be teamed with someone who would be considered pariah. So he took it out on Tenten directly. Then the green-clad Jonin paused and looked around himself before continuing, however, at some point someone must have tried to manipulate her, to make her harm you. To separate you. I don't understand this. However, I will be bringing it to the Hokage's notice as well as Kakashi's. He smiled and nodded in a way that no one could ignore as her pulled Naru into a firm hug and looked down at her. I know it is hard, but I am going to ask you to stay and at least talk to Tenten. Just as she nearly hurt you, she was violated in a similarly person way, her mind was tampered with. Naru nodded into the embrace. She would have never thought of Fuzzy Brows Sr. as such a deep caring person before now. I will try, Guy-sensei. Then he released her and handed her the rest of her clothes and gave her one of his famous nice guy poses. I will find out who did this to you, you can believe it. Yosh, if I can't, no. I will. On my very will, I will do so. Then his expression softened and he smiled gently. I must also speak with Tenten. Be well, young Kunoichi. Then the green beast stepped out to speak with his student. Sasuke's training ground. Sasuke sneered as he looked at a small pond as he walked calmly onto the surface and then once he reached the center reached down and pulled on a lever. Nearby a door slid open and he calmly walked into the wall without even looking around himself as the wall closed behind him silently. Another secret he had learned by using his bloodline, what better place to truly become strong. However, above him Kakashi watched silently and then nodded as he stood a leapt away. He had much to do and a bit more time than he had planned, but not enough to slack off, a plan to work in motion. Hinata's room. How could it be? She had been thinking on it for almost 2 days now. Not that she could allow it to show on the outside, but she was a bit more worried than usual now. Her Naruto-kun was gone on an extended mission. That girl, she'd claimed to be him, had she meant his replacement? How could she have hit her like that? Even now Hinata remained dizzy about it. Her mind burned as she stood and shook herself. She decided to take a walk through the village. She slowly walked out, noticing in the corner of her vision that her father was training her younger sister, and sighed slightly. She wished she was a better kunoichi. She smiled at the cool breeze as she wandered through the village. It was calm and quiet. Then she heard the chattering of familiar voices and drew closer as they walked closer, not even noticing her as they continued to argue. Ino Yamanaka and Sakura Haruno were chatting or arguing. The young Hyuga heiress was uncertain, but once they were close enough she decided to ask. Anyo, Sakura-san? Sakura almost jumped at Hinata's quiet voice and blinked and smiled. Friend Lily. Ah, Hinata-san. What brings you out here? Do you perhaps know where I can find Naruto? She stuttered as she looked over the pair and seemed to shrink into her jacket and flushed as she looked away from the pair. Sorry Hinata, did you try asking the ramen stand owner? Sakura asked, and Hinata smiled slightly and nodded. Thank you, Sakura-san, I will try there next. And the Hyuga heiress walked away, leaving the pair confused but unbothered as they continued their friendly argument about the raven-haired Uchiha. Hinata, however, was saddened to find that said ramen stand had closed for the night already. She sighed and turned to see a shadow standing in the distance. Hello? Then a screech reached her ears and her vision swam. Hinata was out cold before she hit the floor. Tenten's apartment 2 hours after Gaia left. Naru had decided to give Tenten some time to herself. She returned with a bunch of clothes and ninja gear. The lady had been very helpful and helped her pick out a bunch of clothes. Now she was in an orange-sleeved jacket with a black center. Her pants were tighter than usual but had enough pockets for her to deal with. She slowly sat down on the couch and waited, her mind wandering around the room. She noticed how clean it was. Obviously Tenten was one of those who tightened up when she was distressed. Naru had an entire life of dealing with putting horrible pain behind her, but for once she knew it wasn't her friend's fault. Naru? A voice with a slight hiccup sounded throughout the room, and then Tenten stepped in. She was dressed in her usual Chinese garb and suddenly clung to Naru, crying and held her tight, shaking, muttering words Naru couldn't even hope to understand into the blonde's chest. However, even as tears began to fall from her own eyes, Naru hugged her and held her, whispering calmly for her to calm down, and smiled as over time she felt her friend's resistance break down and she sniffed in Naru's grasp. How can you forgive me so easily? You're one of my precious people. Gai-sensei helped too. Naru wasn't joking. The strange Jonin had quelled the storm in her mind and heart. He was far more reliable than she'd thought. She smiled and placed a kiss on Tenten's forehead and smiled. Shish. Tenten-chan. I understand, you were being used. Tenten sniffed and nodded, but she was too frightened to let go. But if I hadn't overreacted, they wouldn't have had the anchor to use the jutsu. I should have figured. However, Naru shifted and made her look into her blue eyes. I forgive you, Tenten. Then the bun-haired girl felt a soft kiss on her lips and blinked as Naru smiled. Let's just be who we are. Explore our life and learn together. I don't know how close we are, I am a bit inexperienced, but if the Orange Book was right, we'd be something like friends with benefits. Naru smiled bright and Tenten shook her head and rested into the blonde's embrace and silently vowed that even if they were only friends now, eventually, they would be more. Naru smiled and looked up at the door only a moment before a knock was heard at the door. Tenten sniffed and crawled from her friend's embrace, and cleaned herself a bit before answering to see Rock Lee standing in front of the door with a badly beaten Neji over his shoulder. Lee, you should be in the hospital? Yash tilted Tenten. I heard from Gai-sensei about our teammate's poor treatment of you and rushed to have a word with him. He looked to the beaten Hyuga and back to her. I think it went well. Tenten giggled weakly and shook her head, and Lee smiled brightly. Remember, Tenten, no matter what, I am your teammate and I wouldn't abandon you. Ever. It would horribly unyouthful. However, now I must take Neji home, and he began to walk away when Neji grunted. See, training, tomorrow. And returned to his unconscious state on Lee's shoulder, but Tenten was smiling so brightly and waved. Looking back to Naru, who had managed to fall asleep in the short time. Tenten decided to grab a blanket and curl up with her on the couch tonight. However, Lee frowned as he moved away from the apartment. Neji had already been injured, it was what gave him the opening to defeat him. What could have wounded you so, Neji? 2 weeks later, Tenten and Naru had been doing well since their breakdown, and Naru was basically living with her and had moved in as a roommate. Although they were together a lot in their free time, nothing had developed between them besides the routine of training, hanging out, sleep, and occasionally Tenten had a mission. Naru on the other hand was better off than ever, although she hadn't learned more jutsu since the first day. Now she was much better at using her resources and was a trained kunoichi. Although Anko keeps hinting at something else rather unpleasant, Naru has gotten a grasp on herself. No source had been found yet, so they were still on the lookout for whatever tried to get to them. Naru was worried though, her dreams had grown even darker as time went on. Hidden Lair Sound Compound. A pair of shadows looked over a heavily bound man. None of his features were visible. Beep, beep, beep. He is stable. Good, send the sound 5, and him as insurance. Of course, the time is right. Sasuke smirked as he walked from the ruined training ground and stood tall, cracking his back and neck with mirthful smile. The smoldering trees and earth seemed to already be mere memories as he moved back into the village. He had decided to train far from the prying eyes of his fellows, and rivals, preferring to be alone. A cool sigh of relief as he crouched down and sipped water from a stream he'd purposefully walked towards on his way back to refresh himself. However, his hairs were standing on end as he heard the near soundless whistling of an object moving towards him. Without even a glacé, he caught the shuriken in a single hand before standing slowly and smiling darkly. "Come out, weaklings," he called in a dreadfully dark tone, his dark eyes scanning the area like a hawk. Slowly 4 shapes slipped from the shadows. One was huge, at least twice the size of the others. Another had 2 sets of arms. The other 2 seemed rather normal, a red-haired girl and a silver-haired boy. "What do you 4 want? Or should I do something about your attempt?" "Ah, Lord Sasuke," Master Orochimaru extends his hand in welcome. "He wishes to show you that he has much power to offer you." The silver-haired boy said, a bit shocked at the ruthless tone the boy had. His master had chosen well. With a single glance at the large shadow, Sasuke smirked and simply tilted his head as he nodded, and before the large ninja moved towards him at surprising speed. But Sasuke merely stepped past him and made a single twitch. The silver-haired boy gasped as the large man collapsed with a groan of pain, and Sasuke merely tilted his head in annoyance, his eyes narrowing, hands in his pockets. A bunch of traitors and cutthroats. Strong though indeed. That should have been lethal. Sasuke seemed to be talking to himself. "If I wish to join, I'll meet you here in 24 hours. Then without another word began to walk away. The other 3 glanced at one another as if waiting to see if the others would strike. None of them dared to. "Sakin, I think I am afraid of him." "I know Yukon, me too." Shadow of intent. Disclaimer. I don't own Naruto. Tsunade sighed as she looked at the paperwork on the table before her. Papers for things that no one would care to look at, but of course had to be signed, stamped and stored away. She smirked as she looked at the paper in front of her. Occasionally Danzo would slip in a form to allow him to remake his shinobi division. She merely crumbled it and tossed it perfectly into a bin with several other very similar forms. She did however wonder how her sensei got all the free time to do the important things he did. Like breath, she mused playfully as the door before her opened almost silently and closed, revealing 2 of her jonin. They had each been assigned to a high-priority mission. This would be the first check-in since it was assigned to them. "Kakashi, Anko, what do you have to report?" They each seemed a bit tense as Kakashi stepped forward. "Hokage-sama, to tell you the truth, Naru's growth is escaping our ability to prepare her for at the pace you recommended. Her chakra control seems to improve constantly, as well as her adaptations to Anko's training. I suspect she'll be of adequate skill level in half the time projected for her. Really, if nothing else, this change seems to have given her extreme focus." He paused as he looked back at his companion and then forward. "However, mentally is another state altogether. She is becoming insular, closer to few than before. I believe something has affected her." Tsunade soaked in the information with a slight nod before simply stating, "Continue as planned for now. When Jiraiya returns, I'll have him evaluate her progress." As they left, Tsunade couldn't help but wonder why she needed a report on a single genin's progress, no matter how important. She shrugged it off and returned to her paperwork. Konoha training ground. Neji sighed as he slammed his hands into the tree before him. Wood cracked and the tree exploded into ribbons as he looked down at his bleeding fingers, annoyed, before standing tall looking at the ruins with a cold eye. He had been training and conditioning himself rigorously since the Chunin exams. He wouldn't fail twice. He would get revenge on the Uchiha and show everyone that a caged bird can soar. A loud snap of a tree branch brought Neji around as he looked at the newcomer. The words slipped from his lips with an automatic quality to them. "Hinata-sama, how can I help you?" Neji's keen eyes easily saw all the nuances and small posture differences between how his cousin Normal stood when she greeted him and frowned slightly before she smiled, and it made a small shiver crawl through him. "A spar cousin. My sister has grown boring." Neji's eyes narrowed as he looked at Hinata before he shook it off. "If you wish it to be so." And with a practiced ease slipped into the first stance of the gentle fist. However, Hinata stood tall and smiled in a vicious, almost unnatural way, and Neji flinched. He waited a few moments before simply deciding to make the first move, a left-hand strike feint to a twin strike on her defending hand. However, it was not to be. Once he got within her defensive range, she still hadn't taken a defensive stance, so instead he moved for a blow to her chest. "Foolish cousin," he stated calmly before he stopped mid-strike. Hinata had literally grabbed his wrist mid-strike and was looking down at him with bored eyes. "Neji-san, I thought you were strong," she said in a deathly calm as she released his hand. He gasped as he tried to shake off the numbness that had begun to climb up his arm. He blinked as he stared into Hinata's eyes and then stood and frowned. "Impressive. I don't know who you are, but you are not." His words were lost as Hinata dropped her heavy coat to the ground, revealing her bare shoulders and a tight form-fitting blue undershirt. Neji shook his head, ignoring the thoughts that entered his mind as a sly smile crossed Hinata's lips. "Cousin, so high and mighty. Put down another for their secrets, but you have your own. I will add another for you. I will add the secret of your loss here." At these words Neji growled, flushed and charged forward with a deadly abandon, his pride wounded. 128 strikes of divination. Konoha restricted training ground, Forest of Death. 3 hours later. Naru smiled as she slipped through the forest almost silently. Her stealth training was going well, it seemed, as she tracked off towards her target. To be a bit stealthier, she was wearing a skin-tight camo jacket and a pair of tight shorts, with ninja pocket inserts and special little traps for if she's caught by an unsuspecting foe. She'd learned under Anko, who had given her a small penalty each time she failed, and Anko's punishments were embarrassing and more than a bit indignant. Her thoughts suddenly moved to her other sensei that has been very absent as of late. Kakashi hadn't been seen since the first couple of days of her training. Ever since she'd been left in Anko's capable or molesting, depending who you asked, hands. Although she'd been stalking the massive forest for 2 days in a row, now trying to learn stealth to a level her sensei considered proficient. There was no way she'd be able to sneak up on the assassination specialist without a ton of luck, situation, and distraction. She moved quietly towards where she'd figured her target zone was, careful and swift as possible. She knew if she was too slow, she'd fail. If she was too fast, she'd make noise, so she had to make a balance in it. As she got to the tree line, she paused and leaned around a tree to get a good look at the target zone, but as she redistributed her weight, a twig snapped. She groaned silently and braced herself for her sensei, but moments passed without Anko's appearance. She thought suddenly that she might still have a chance to defeat the challenge as swept down into the zone, kunai in hand. Her eyes immediately locked onto the purple hair of her sensei, and she sped over and placed a kunai towards her. "Surrender, sensei," she stated as coolly as possible before her head literally fell off, making Naru jump back in shock. Before she could react, she felt a pair of hands curl up her body, her jacket not even slowing her as the owner whispered into Naru's ear. "Naughty, little Kunoichi fell into our trap. I think we could show this little Konoha slut how it feels to fall from grace." Anko had a thing with role-playing Naru's failures. Pretending to be the enemy as Anko nibbled on Naru's ears, causing a small moan to escape her lips and a quiet purr to hum through her throat. As she pressed against her sensei, not even opening her eyes when she felt her jacket open and being pulled away, slipping to the solid ground. However, their play was cut off by a subtle cough. Anko instantly was on guard, but Naru was blinking, pressed half nude to her sensei and trying to concentrate as the man standing before her before Anko left her and slipped forward, letting Naru fall onto her rear. Her jacket dropped on top of her form. Lady Hokage, sealed access to this zone pending my approval. Or hers. So Anbu, why are you here? Naru heard Anko ask dangerously. I am not under such restrictions. The calm level voice said. Naru couldn't make out whose it was. Oh? Says who? An important directive. I was assigned just before the reign of Lady Hokage. The Anbu stated before Anko seemed to step closer quickly. As it has reached this point, I hereby invoke Executive Order 102.3, however, as per the Fourth's wishes, for now it will be left for you and Kakashi-senpai to decide what goes on past this point. Here is the information. Then a swish of the wind and silence reigned for minutes. Anko was next to Naru and pulled her up, and sat next to her quietly and pulled the jacket off of the blonde's head, and they sat there for a few moments. What do you want in life, now Naru? Anko asked quietly, her eyes looking over the young girl. What are you? Don't. Naru. It doesn't matter, but this can't be easy. I know it can't be. You can tell me. I'll listen. Anko said in a soft voice, her usually tough and powerful tone, broken into a quiet and sincere whisper. Naru didn't notice the tears before they fell and struck her hands, before she shook her head, annoyed, wiping at them to try to make them disappear. Even weeks later, she couldn't stop herself from boiling over and clinging to Anko, her frame shaking heavily. Anko smiled slightly, if a bit awkward, as she looked down at the once boy, sighed and began running her hand through the girl's long hair and held her uncomfortably. Anko wasn't the type to hold others or be held, but Tsunade was a rather persuasive woman, and really it was hard to not want to empathize with the poor girl. She'd been through being a village pariah, and it wasn't pretty then, and still isn't. However, unlike the young Jinchuriki, had lived her entire life as a target, and just as she'd found some sort of foundation, her entire life spun around and forced her to throw it all away, and now she was basically starting over. I don't know. That's the thing. She looks up at Anko and her eyes were searching for an answer. Who am I? Naruto? Naru? I don't know. It all so mixed together. I remember a few things as Naruto, but I remember so much more as me. I can remember sleeping on a bed with Ba-chan, after the battle with Oroteme. She smiled a bit, remembering the event between her and the fifth, like it was just happening, before something makes her frightened expression. I remember many things. It's like living two lives. All these things that I did, but then there's Naruto, and his life seems so much nicer. Anko didn't know what to say to all of this. So, you have new memories? Yes. I mean, I think these memories of Naruto are what's causing all of these problems. I used to be such a good kunoichi. Anko was shocked to silence, as she tried to register what Naru had just said. Naruto was the invasive memories? How could this be? As she felt Naru shift in her grasp and nuzzled into the crook of the special Jonin's neck and continued to sob quietly. Who would do this? Oroteme? Ero Sennin? Sasuke-kun? Is this another punishment? She whispered sadly into Anko's neck, and she felt a bit dizzy. It was all moving way too fast for her. Anko kissed the top of Naru's head and sighed a bit as she looked to the young girl, who obviously needed to be able to relate to someone else, and her voice burned in her throat as the words slipped out. Naru-chan. Did I ever tell you about my sensei? No. I will, soon, I promise. Hokage's office. Tsunade's eyes widened as she leaned back in her chair. A part of her mind was beginning to burn. It was difficult to concentrate for a few minutes as she decided to take a sip of sake and think on the general state of her village. However, this was interrupted by the appearance of Jiraiya, who looked a bit spooked and stepped into the room without even a smile. He should have been halfway to his destination by now. Tsunade groaned and hissed angrily to get the old man's attention, but he merely stepped forward and looked Tsunade in the eye. Suheim, the principle of manipulation and effects on spectrum. Do you know what that is? He asked as Tsunade looked at him a bit annoyed but nodded, but it was obvious from her expression it was only basic at most. It was an idea proposed by the second and later the fourth Hokage. That the possibility of a jutsu that supersedes the barrier of time and space could have an overbleeding effect on the world. Tsunade looked at him a bit lost and tilted her head, and Jiraiya sighed a bit before he waved his hand in a circle. Think of your life. And I created jutsu to go back in time and make it so that you fell in love with me. In that time the world would shift to meet that expectation. However, such a technique is impossible. Before he takes a small breath and looked to the wall with pictures of the previous Hokages. Until now. What do you mean? I think that the technique that changed Naru. He broke off as if confused and looked to Tsunade, who seemed to be waiting for something. What's Naru's full name? Tsunade. Naru Uzumaki, obviously. No, his birth name. What do you mean, his? Jiraiya frowned as he nodded. This overbleed was serious. The entire world was being shifted by this. The sheer amount of chakra it would require. He shook his head. Luckily he'd marked himself with a powerful seal, allowing him to retain the old memories and the new ones. This jutsu literally is affecting the world, and is having a far more profound effect than anyone could have thought. It can change anything, the sheer amount of power this would require. He muttered quietly before he sighed and remembered something and began to run his hand along the charter for dead civilians and frowned. Strange. Where would Mr. Musi be? I noticed his bar is gone. Tsunade followed his look as the Toad Sage decided to look through the register of criminal execution of civilians and dropped the book before looking to Tsunade. For her part, she could tell whatever he just saw wasn't something she'd enjoy. But once she flipped to the page, her face paled and she sat down. Executed for extreme breach of the Third's Protection Law, Article 2.43. Situation upgraded to top secret. Tsunade frowned as she looked up to see the face of her lifelong friend. We'll need Asuma's permission to access Sensei's vault. Then she paged through the mission portfolio and frowned. Team Asuma was currently inactive. However, Asuma was on an extended A-class mission. Zero contact, no less. Time has been changed, completely. And we are just catching up to it. I watched a man fade away. Tsunade. Jiraiya let out a slow breath and frowned. I'll need to check in now. The mission isn't important enough anymore. As soon as Anko brings her out, I need to be alerted. Then he sighed and smiled slightly and tilted his head a bit before pulling a snapshot from his jacket and smiling. At least, it's not all bad. He stated before dropping the photo onto the desk. It was an image of herself holding an unconscious blonde girl on a hotel bed with Shizune on the other side protectively, and all Tsunade could do was wipe away the tears that well up at the expressions of contentment and warmth that the image showed. She could almost smell Naru's cheap shampoo and giggled a bit at the thought before she realized. She'd remembered that. This was serious. Konoha Borderlands. A quiet shape slipped through the underbrush. Although it was alone and obvious not a civilian, it had obviously dodged all the patrols and continued moving along the border and stopped once it reached the infamous crossing ground. The Valley of the End. The form stopped and its ragged gray traveling cloak shifted in the wind as it looked towards Konoha, and an inhumanly large sneer was visible beneath the hood. Then with the same movements it headed back, disappearing into the woods. Tenten's apartment. Tenten sighed as she paced her apartment, more than a bit worried. Her intuition was burning. She knew something was wrong. There were little clues all over, and although she couldn't easily place them, she knew they were tied to her roommate. She sighed as her mind wandered. Naru hadn't been home in days. Her training was extremely intense from what her sensei mentioned before he too went out on assignment. It was a bit worrying. Most of the best Jonin were out doing missions to show that Konoha was just as strong as ever. Even so, there was only so much you could do, but she knew in the pit of her stomach something was wrong with the blonde. Be safe, Naru. As she left to go do some training, setting up a small trap designed to show if someone entered and then was gone. Konoha 30 years in the future. Fire burning, consuming everything as the sound of crashing lightning and sounding thunder cut the sky, red tales of rage and hatred tearing at the world like a force of nature unleashed. Indeed it was. Naruto Namikaze had died to bring this about, a broken cage doing the last thing he could to defeat the ultimate foe. However, this was nothing more than a delay tactic. The power of the Great Fox now being siphoned away, being used to power some kind of jutsu as the village attempted to fight alongside the massive fox. However, the surprise of the sudden attack caught the village too far off guard and they had only a few fleeting moments remaining before they were crushed. Naruto's body laying crumpled on the monument, bearing his own likeness, a confident smile on his face. 3 groups of Anbu were fleeing the city with a small bundle in hand. They attempted to rush on, before several shinobi with fan-like symbols on their headbands cut them off. Traitors! In the name of the Hokage is dead, now is the time of the Uchiha. Bastards. One of the Anbu growled before flashing forward, only to be met with destruction as his abdomen exploded open as if it were torn by an animal, his cat mask falling as Konohamaru collapsed in agony. His final moments fleeting away. Then everything shifted as another of the Anbu removed its mask, revealing a rather scarred Kiba who merely snarled and looked around them before smiling a bit and nodding. Fine. Getso, with me, the rest keep going. As he bent into a stance that he had created, the Hideo no Kith. He didn't even know if it meant anything, after all this was its first use. Getso nodded and stepped forward, not bothering to waste time to remove his mask by hand. Moments later, holding up his hands in a near-surrender fashion, a pair of trees begin rising from the bare earth, his wooden mask melting away. "Leave them to me," a cool female voice said as the other shinobi disappeared to allow the newcomer to face Kiba and Getso alone and continue the fight. "You look so much like Yamato," she cooed. "I'll kill you for this, Sakura, Haim." His voice was darkly violent, even as Kiba howled ready to strike forward. It was then that the fox cried its lament and the world came crashing down, the sky dripped red and fire burned at the forest. Kiba and Getso suddenly were caught off guard as they stared at the distorting landscape, the world melting and burning before their own gaze. Sakura, however, just smiled softly and looked past them as her hands clenched and she burst forward, flying into the village, tossing the pair of ruined hearts into the streets. "I'll be with Sasuke Koi forever, I have to stop Nami from getting to him." Even as she stepped into the massive red chamber where her love was supposed to be, her blood ran cold. Bodies everywhere as her eyes finally fell to the completed ritual circle. When she did, all she could do is scream. Then it all shattered, like glass thrown to the floor, the fox melted away. Sakura turned her eyes, gazing out of the room as the world broke apart, fire bursting from the ground and a single whisper flowed through her body. "Just as I willed it, goodbye fallen world." Shadow of intent. Disclaimer. I don't own Naruto. Naru awoke in a cold sweat, as she looked around the room in the tower. The images of the strange dream melting away. Her eyes only slowly came into focus as she let out a shaky breath. Before today she'd never explored much of the tower, but this was her last night before returning to the village after a week of constant survival training and getting her motor skills, balance, and speed back into focus. It was easier now that she'd forgotten almost all of the invasive memories. Her mind slowly wandered to her roommate and then to her sensei before she sighed. "I wonder how Sasuke-kun is doing," before her mind slipped to her other teammate and her expression grew sourer. Her and Sakura hadn't seen eye to eye often, but she didn't care anymore. It was pointless, but her dreams, those bothered her. They were morbid and incarnate hate. Then there was the fox. It was so quiet now that it was like just before her mission in Wave. She could remember the constant pulsing of the horrible demon's will, but now, it was all gone. "I see you've awoken, Gaki," a male voice said from the doorway, and Naru turned to see the old Sannin in his usual attire. "From what I have heard, you've improved. More than ever before, Ero Sennin." Jiraiya could feel his brow pulse at the nickname before she continued, "I bet I could even give you a run for your money." She boasted and he smiled. "Then why not put your money where your mouth is?" He teased, and Naru looked to him and hopped to the front of her bed soundlessly and smiled almost so wickedly the old shinobi had to rub his eyes. It was like a blonde Anko. It took Naru only minutes to get ready and he couldn't deny her enthusiasm. He decided to wait in the hall, as her teachers arrived, and he smiled at the pair. "She wanted to spar with me, so I'll be borrowing the tournament grounds. Hope you don't mind." Anko just shrugged and Kakashi blinked before raising his single eye to match his elder's gaze, and then he said, "You'll regret it, Tilda," before disappearing off to who knows where. Anko, on the other hand, was going to go watch. The contenders entered the room less than 10 minutes later, Anko watching in rapt silence as they measured up, shifted and waited. Then in a sudden blur Naru shot toward the Sannin soundlessly, her body almost a blur of golden hair as she performed a quick kick towards the old man's head. It was easily blocked by a single hand, however he had to quickly release her as a kunai flew from her hands towards him. Had he been less experienced, that could have been fatal. When he looked to find her, she was visibly undetectable, but the old toad sage merely smiled before spinning around and delivering a nasty backhand easily empowered with enough chakra to take off a man's head. Naru gasped as she slammed into the ground, her small body making a large indentation into the ground. The toad Sanin merely smirked for a moment, but slowly he became less confident as the small girl remained unmoving for a bit too long, and then he silently took a few steps until he knew what he was hearing. The crying of a teenage girl. The legendary sage quickly moved to her side, his own male instincts kicking in as he smiled brightly. Naru, you'll be okay, right? His apology cut short as a hand slammed roughly into his crotch and a pair of tight shapely teenage legs curled around his neck. A single blade pointing to his personal junk. He coughed in agony and closed his eyes. Why you do this? He squeaked and groaned as the hand tightened. 3 mistakes of fighting a skilled kunoichi. First, letting your guard down because I am a girl. Second, holding back because you think you're too strong. She snarled as Jiraiya dropped to his knees and looked up to Naru gasping. What about the third? Oh, the ultimate sin? What did I do? You're an old pervert. That. A voice said from her right and she looked up shocked to see the very sage she had in her grasp standing next to her. He smiled at her expression. Shadow clone. Suddenly, her position was far less ironclad. A single shadow clone had pushed her to her limit, and even took her using a good trick. One she thought would work. It could even take a hit. Wow, you might actually be half as good as you boast. Arrow Senin. The older man smirked and then nodded. Of course. I did after all teach the fourth, and am known far and wide for my strength and gallant looks. Naru smiled and shook her head as she began to giggle. However, his features slowly darkened as he became more serious. However, Naru, I need to give you a once-over. Tsunade wants me to check something. I believe it may have something to do with your condition. Naru looked up at the older man and blinked owlishly, as her giggles dissipated. Condition? She asked as Anko landed next to her and also looked to the older shinobi confused. What condition? Jiraiya however just shook his head a bit. The condition that caused you to become a girl. Birth? She responded and Anko laughed a bit at the strange joke. However, it was just as Jiraiya had thought. The contamination was worsening. However, the seal he'd developed seemed to inure him to its effects. It was based in Minato's theories, so really most of the credit was due to him. No, it's not important now. Just know I need to examine the seal and perform a couple of diagnostics. I was going to wait until your training was done here, but I need to take Anko with me on an information gathering mission today, so I will have to do this now. Naru frowned a bit and glared. If it was any other pervert I'd say you were up to something. Looking the toad sage over before smiling and nodding. Go ahead, I trust you. Arrow Senin. Jiraiya frowned as he looked to Anko and said, we should head to the medical center, I need her to lay down. Anko and Naru followed behind as the clone disappeared into smoke and the purple-haired woman wrapped an arm around Naru. Don't worry, you'll get him one day. She whispered and Naru smiled a bit. After all, you are my student, and I am proud of your progress. Before she slipped off of the girl. Naru however, blushed and nodded completely red-faced, as they continued towards the destination. Konoha Gate. Sasuke smirked a bit as he continued to walk. Like a shadow he slipped past the gate. The guards didn't even look at him as he walked into the clearing where the Sound Four waited for him and leaned back against a tree. Does this mean you accept? Lord Sasuke? Sakin asked warily. They had come prepared to give him the ritual if he accepted. Obviously. You, woman. Tayuya was tempted to shout at him, but the image of Hirobu being taken out so easily flashed in her mind. She'd never get her flute out in time to affect the Uchiha. I know we will be pursued. He stated casually, before smirking, so I'll tell you this. Make sure you survive. She blinked at the strange statement he made but nodded slowly and looked to the largest member of the team who seemed to be rather calm, even after Sasuke's attack last time they had met. The large shinobi set down the sealing barrel that would hold Sasuke. We need you to take this and climb in. We will carry you the rest of the way. Sasuke merely nodded as he stepped in and the top was affixed, prepared to die, Uchiha-san. As the box was sealed and Sasuke gulped down the medicine, agony burning through him. As the voice began to whisper the truth into his ear. Power is the means to complete my destiny. Unknown location. Hinata calmly stepped back into a brightly lit laboratory and looked over the dozens of experiments going on in here. Most of the room was beakers with chemicals, but there were a few animals as well, but no one else was in the room. Master? She called out quietly, but it was like a crack of lightning in the otherwise silent lab. Hinata, A voice said from behind the girl, and her eyes widened substantially as she turned to face a man in a dark cloak with a hood hiding his features. She hadn't heard him enter, nor seen him standing where she had been only moments before. "You were right, I think the experiment is working," she said as she flexed her muscles and smiled up at the hooded figure. "It is good that you were able to do so much before the time was up." She smiled brightly as she walked closer. "The effect of the jutsu will wear off soon. Once the Kyuubi reawakens, the next phase begins. I may not see you for some time." The young Hyuga heiress nodded, before sighing and looking through the sealed chambers containing dozens of animals. This was a truly perfect opportunity, however, she mentioned as she motioned to a cot hidden behind the tables. "What shall I do with her?" "I mean, without you here, master?" The cloaked figure merely raised his hand. "Worry not for your other half. Her current body will leave her powerless, and even if she manages to escape, no one will believe her." Then the figure grunted and sighed almost in pure exasperation. "Time draws short, it is beginning to stir. You have your mission. Complete it." And then the figure was gone, as if the shadows had eaten him alive. Hinata, however, sneered dangerously, "Of course, master." Several hours later, Hokage's office. Tsunade groaned as she looked to the report in front of her. Sasuke had left the village sometime last night. Possibly by Orochimaru and his servants. And all of the most experienced shinobi are out on missions. "Shizune, get me Shikamaru. We are going to go after him," Tsunade said darkly. Shikamaru sighed as he looked over the files in front of him. He had less than a half hour remaining to gather his team. It had to be just right, his first command, and an emergency retrieval mission for a ninja that may have been abducted by the Sound Village. However, something in the back of his mind told him that this would be more than just a quick grab-and-go operation. To make matters worse, he only had genin to choose from. He calmly filed away Choji, Neji, and Kiba. 3 powerful upfront fighters who each have tracking skills. He couldn't help but take another genin, a few years his senior, Mizumi. She was a dedicated tracker with some skill as a healer. A good choice. However, he needed another dedicated front-line fighter, someone who would be dedicated to saving Sasuke. Immediately, Ino and Sakura were ruled out. Dedicated, yes, but neither was skilled in upfront fighting. Slowly a smirk appeared on the young genius's face. Naruto's profile was exactly what he needed: dedication, upfront power, and being trained by a special Jonin specializing in assassination, an elite Jonin, and a Sannin. She was definitely a powerhouse to receive so much attention. He couldn't ignore the fights during the exam either. He nodded calmly as he looked over profiles, until he came to a genin on a longer-term assignment. Naruto Uzumaki, who is that? He was curious as he noted that this boy had the same last name, birth date, and graduation date as Naruto did. Even the names were similar. He couldn't shake a strange feeling of familiarity with the name. Slowly, however, he looked out to the village and thought about it: Neji, Kiba, Choji, Naruto, Mizumi, and himself. A well-rounded retrieval team and a dangerous combat team. It was also a serious risk. Besides himself, there were 2 other clan heirs and the nephew of a clan head on this mission. But he knew no one would object such a risk for saving the precious Uchiha. He calmly wondered what he had done to deserve all of this work, but he knew that he could lead his team to an effective checkmate. Better than any genin he knew, and with all the other shinobi occupied, that was his sole choice. He calmly signed the scroll and slipped onto the messenger hawk's neckband and leaned back, sighing quietly as he looked up to the sky. Dark clouds to the south, the direction they were heading, like a sheet of black. He closed his eyes. It was not a good omen. What a drag. Shadow of intent. Disclaimer: I don't own Naruto. Arc 1 Finale. Part 1. Konoha 30 years in the future. The Hokage rested calmly upon his chair, looking out to see his village. It was many times the size it had been in his youth. Konoha was the most powerful city in the world, possessing many skilled and powerful shinobi, as well as the most powerful tailed beast container. It was nothing less than an empire now. During the previous war, the council had been dissolved, and the daimyo gave full control of the country to the reigning Hokage. The Fifth Great Ninja War. The Hokage remained calm even as he thought back to the horrors of that time. Slowly, however, much like his own dark thoughts, a grim darkness seemed to seep into the room. During the war, Konoha had been attacked by a coalition of two great villages, Iwa and Kumo. Konoha's allies were Oto and Suna. The irony was never lost on the Hokage. However, the war seemed to only grow and grow. Soon the samurai legions were clashing and the war was renamed the Great War. Indeed, it was the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. Oto and Suna merged with Konoha, unable to fend off the attacks from the growing coalition, now numbering 5 minor villages and the same 2 great villages. It was all to the Hokage's plan. Soon he was given more and more power to stop the enemy until the fateful day came where he was given it all. He was now the daimyo and Hokage. Then he unleashed himself onto the enemy, and they fled. Fear, hatred, despair, carnage, and revenge. These were the emotions the Hokage could feel from his victims. However, the last held a special place of hate in his heart. This was all about revenge to him. It was Naruto. A cool voice said, as the clan head of the Uchiha clan entered his office. His throne room, the only other immortal shinobi in the world. Sasuke's immortality was gained through the use of his brother's eyes, while Naruto's, well, no one is sure. But Naruto hasn't gotten a day older than 28. Sasuke, I have told you, it's Hokage-sama now. As he turned in his chair to look at the Uchiha. He was dressed to fight, not in his usual casual wear. Naruto's face turned into a grimace, as he had already figured what would happen next. Oh, is it time now, for us to fight? For your people to fight mine? Tell me, is my granddaughter loyal to you, or me? He was so calm and Sasuke could only grow more frustrated by his ability to always be a step ahead. They stared into one another's eyes for a long time, and the Hokage couldn't help but remember all he had done to save his friend. Blood, so much blood had been spilled, so much death. All to save one man, one insignificant man, but to the Hokage, this man was beyond important, beyond necessary. However, as time grew on, more and more had to be given. Some prices were just too high. Naruto's eyes were no longer blue, but a deep fearsome red, like blood spilled on the floor. Are you going to answer me, Uchiha-kun? Sasuke's mouth tightened as he looked at his longtime friend, and Kage, this was hard. Far harder than the Valley of the End, harder than the war. My daughter has decided to not be here to witness your death. He paused so he could spit the last words, Hokage-sama. Naruto's face was passive, as he looked out to see a picture on his desk. It was aged now, but it was precious. 3 blondes together. Now only one of them was still alive. Naruto himself. Fine, Otokage-kun, let us make war then. Then the room erupted in flames, as the power of the Rokudame was released. I hope you're ready to die, Sasuke. Your tyranny ends here, Naruto. Naru, Konoha present day. Naru's eyes fluttered into focus, as she noted an annoyed-looking Kiba, looking down at her. Come on, Naru, we have a mission. Mission? She asked, almost confused as she moved from where she had been daydreaming, against the wall outside Tenten's apartment. Kiba nodded quickly, noting that she was already geared up and ready anyway. Of course he didn't mind seeing the blonde figure, she was a bit of an early bloomer. Yeah, Sasuke's been kidnapped. Naru's eyes widened. Sasuke-kun? She didn't know if she should be shocked, frightened, or angry. Then what are we waiting for? Kiba nodded as she leapt off to the next roof, and he smiled as he watched her go. That training must have rocked. Cuss her ass is smoking Tilda. A moment later rock flew past his head, and he quickly decided to move to catch up before she tried to kill him. Well, it wasn't his fault. He reasoned, after all the way she had beaten him in the exams was to flash him, nearly killed him with blood loss. Akamaru. As the pup leapt onto his head and they two headed off to the gates of Konoha. Naru, however, also remembered the fight with Kiba in the Chunin exams, a light blush lighting her cheeks as she moved ahead. She'd never thought of her body as being anything special before Kiba's outburst in the exam. The fight had ended when Akamaru and Kiba's attacks had damaged her clothes enough to cause her shirt to tear off, distracting Kiba long enough for a good kick to the base of his neck. Now Anko-sensei had taught her a lot more about that kind of fighting. Still, Kiba was an ally, she didn't want to think about it. Konoha gates. Naru looked at the group of her friends that had gathered. Kiba, Choji, Shikamaru looked the same as ever, ready to do what they do best. Her eye drifted to Neji, who had a black blindfold on, and was wearing his usual outfit and stood in his usual dismissive manner. Naru was curious about the blindfold, but then there was the other member, a fire red-headed girl that looked closer to 20 than anyone else here. She didn't smile, and her face looked more predisposed to frowning as she looked over to Naru and then the rest of the group. "Alright, let's go," Shikamaru stated calmly. The group moved quickly, leaving behind a silent, hooded figure that was looking on from afar, with a wide smile on her face as she turned back into the village to prepare for the next events. "My master, hurry back." Fire Country border valley of the end. A pair of figures calmly stepped onto the head of Madara Uchiha's statue. One was dressed in a ragged cloak, and the other was wearing the uniform of the Sound Five, a pair of dots upon his brow. "I told you they rarely passed through here, Kagaya-kun. I did not lie. The Lord will be pleased," the ragged figure stated, waving his hand dismissively as he calmly leapt to the other side, and looked back, waving the young man to follow. "With me here, young man, your mission is a guaranteed success." As he continued to move forward, the young Kagaya Kimimaro looked at him appraising ly. "Yes, however my time is limited. My body is not perfect any long." He was broken off as the man's hand wrapped around his throat, quicker than the platinum blonde could react to, a feat in of itself. However, the eyes beneath made the Kagaya shiver a bit, as the hand seemed to bite into him. The figure's arm was the color of long dead skin, a sickish gray. Ah, poisoned by the cursed seal. A nasty infection. Had they not waited to repair me before this mission, or had you been too active, this would be fatal. Then a grim feeling filled the area, as a loud slurping filled the area. "Shish, Kagaya-kun, soon you will be all better," as he smiles, a smile far too wide for a human face. His teeth reflected in the light. "The devourer will save you." Fire County Forest. The Sound Four calmly entered the clearing and waited. They knew they were being pursued at this point, and they all nodded to each other. "Tayuya, take Sasuke-sama forward. We'll hold them off long enough for you." The Genjutsu specialist nodded and fled quickly. The largest member, Jirobo, calmly gathered chakra and smirked. "Not that it will matter for long, soon, he'll be awake." A grim laugh filled the area as Yukon leapt away into the trees as Kidomaru smiled and disappeared in a blur of motion, setting the ambush without more than a few moments of motion. It took only 3 minutes for the Konoha party to arrive, Naru in front as she looked to the large man and snarled loudly. Shikamaru, Choji and Kiba were next, followed by Neji and Mizumi. Naru's eyes narrowed as a grim rage overcame her and she tilted her head. "Where is Vampire Mud Dome?" Naru's eyes widened as the man merely muttered the words, and the dome sprung up, closing around all of them, and the large man laughed. "Was that it? I expected more. Now you are trapped in my inescapable trap," as he began to siphon their chakra to empower the technique further. "Not exactly." The calm voice of Neji Hyuga caught the large man off guard, especially since it was behind him. When did you?" However, the other two members wasted no time to strike, each slamming a pair of kunai into the dirt where Neji once stood. "Where did he go?" As an explosion rocked the area and Jirobo took a step back, and stared wide-eyed at the sight before him. Neji was standing next to the ruined dome, with his entire group at his side. The blonde-haired girl's face was twisted in a snarl as she looked at the auto ninja and sneered, as she lowered her hand. "Naru, Mizumi, continue on. We'll take care of them," Shikamaru stated calmly, as Kiba, Choji, and Neji slipped into a combat position. Naru looked ready to argue, but the older woman's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "It's an order. Let's go." Naru looked to her friends and smiled before she was gone. She and Mizumi had disappeared into the branches. "Now, what shall we do with you three?" Kiba asked as he cracked his neck. However, in answer each of them slowly began to transform into their level 2 state, not wasting any time now that they seemed to be a genuine threat. Shikamaru's sigh filled the clearing, slightly below the three's chuckles. "Troublesome. You just had to ask, didn't you?" Neji, however, remained calm, slipping into one of the Goken stances and smirking. None of them noticing the shadow bounding overhead, only a moment behind Naru and Mizumi. Fire Country Forest large clearing. Tayuya stumbled into the clearing and sprinted forward, looking behind herself occasionally. Silent complaints filled her mind as she carried the box holding the Uchiha, about his weight and annoyance level. She moved to look back again only to slam into someone hard enough to take her from her feet. Who the, as she noticed Kimimaro and the figure called the Devourer standing before her. She gulped heavily. Kimimaro. But I thought, incompetent as ever. He stated, and only then did she notice that the Devourer had caught the sealed box, and the pair seemed to look down at her like she was meat, and not work the air that had been wasted on her. I am sorry, I was just, a hand sprung from beneath the cloak and grabbed her harshly, lifting her from the dirt, and sneered, looking to Kimimaro for a moment before clenching harder. Did we ask for your piss-poor excuses? Give me one good reason why I shouldn't just put you to good use? The Devourer said, his mouth seemed to spring up all over his arms, dripping saliva. Because, Sasuke-sama said, I need to live. The Devourer's eyes widened and he swore, before looking back to Kimimaro and then to her. You're fucking lucky. The she was dropped as the pair of Konoha ninja entered the clearing, and Naru blinked and snarled again, as Mizune took her side. 3 on 2, you may need some more friends, Naru said as she brushed a bit of stray hair from her face and smirked. Mizume's eyes widened as she looked at the cloaked figure, and she slowly collapsed to her knees as she hissed loudly in pain. Naru was shocked, but the Devourer laughed, and Kimimaro merely stood forward, and looked back to the girl. Take the vessel to the Valley of the End and await us, or depart after an hour. She was gone moments later. Oi, Kimimaro-chan, I want the purple-haired one. You can have the blonde. Kimimaro seemed confused as he looked from the redhead to the blonde and was about to voice his problem before the cloak seemed to disappear, revealing a dead gray-skinned man, with dozens of fanged mouths all over his chest, and a handsome, if slightly deformed face as his lips stretched into an inhuman grin. Oh come now, as he raised his left hand, which shifted into a fanged maw, and it began to suck loudly, dispelling the jutsu hiding Mizume's true identity. Surely you noticed. Anko snarled as she slowly stood and prepared to fight the pair, a kunai in hand. However, her eyes continued to look over the man, something about him, so familiar. Her other hand clenching her burning seal. Enough, shall we start? Couldn't say it better myself. Kage Bushin no Jutsu. As a massive smoke cloud filled the clearing. Valley of the End. Tayuya panted as she reached the end of her journey and set down the box, panting loudly as she looked around. Slowly, however, the box began to leak purple chakra, and she smiled. So fast. It should have taken much longer, before it exploded open, the dark chakra forcing her back a step. From the cloud she could hear Sasuke chuckle. This is amazing. So this is real power. Tayuya was in shock. No one had ever mastered the seal so quickly, not even Kimimaro. Sasuke's body had completely adjusted already? The cold, dark-colored eyes of Sasuke looked at her, and he moved closer. You are not to interfere. No matter what, or I will make you beg for death. My little friend. The dark words of the young Uchiha caused her to shiver. Of course, what? Sasuke's dark eyes pierced into hers, and she could barely breathe. This was his killing intent? It was amazing, overwhelming even. A flash of red seemed to melt her resistance completely. Of course, Sasuke-sama. Her voice sounded like a broken doll. It made her both furious and happy at the same time. She knew he'd done something, but she couldn't even speak. Now we wait. Naru smiled at her small army of clones as they cheered and set themselves into a battle position. Naru looked to Anko, and frowned as she looked over her sensei. She seemed to be shaking, and Naru could figure the source was one of the 2 men before her. But how could they be so fearsome? No, it didn't matter. As 3 of the clones charged each of the men, she slipped in front of Anko and smirked back at her sensei, her eyes as shining in the sun. I don't know what's happening, sensei, but I will protect you. However, moments after she said that, she received the pain of her clones all dispersing at once and was brought to her knees instantly. Her body shaking, each clone had given her the same memory. Having their lives devoured and sucked away. Sensei. These 2, there's something. She coughed a bit, and looked back to her enemies only a moment before the gray man would have struck her down, his hand a maw of sharp teeth. I guess it's a 2-for-1 deal. He shouted and slammed his arm down, his face sprayed with blood as he looked up to Anko and snarled. Ah, little Anko-chan, tell me, do you remember me? His smile seemed to widen as he tasted the delicious flavor of the girl's blood. Anko's eyes were locked on his, and she shivered for a moment longer before smirking a bit. What are you, Rasengan? The devourer looked down a moment before being slammed in the face by the sphere of pure chakra obliterating his head. Kimimaro looked over calmly. Somehow the girl had shifted at the last second, the wound only in her leg instead of her heart. He was impressed. The devourer was one of the most annoying types of ally. Not especially good at anything but using his bloodline, but Kimimaro was similar enough to not hold it against the man. Not that it mattered now. Yeah, we did it, Anko-sensei. Oh tilde, don't be polite on my account tilde. A playful voice said as the pair of Konoha ninja looked over to the headless body that was slowly standing. Kimimaro was even shocked as he looked on. What kind of monster was this man, whom his lord had worked with so long ago? Slowly one of the mouths shifted up and with it a new head seemed to grow, and he smiled but the skin looked fresh and alive. I suppose, I can do this the right way. I owe it to the little Gaki-chan. Anko blinked as she looked over the healthy face, no longer deformed by the large mouth, or dead-looking skin. Even his voice seemed younger and more playful. Her head began to burn. Gaki-chan, why does it sound? She wondered as she placed a hand on the side of her head. Then instead of the freakish dead man, a young man stood before them. He looked more like an Uchiha now, rather than whatever he was. TCH, starting to remember me? He sounded almost annoyed as he cracked his neck and made a single hand sign with his right hand, closing his eyes, as a torrent of chakras seemed to swirl around him. How did you do that? Naru demanded as she prepared to use one of her newer jutsu that she had wanted to keep secret a bit longer. The soul consumption bloodline, Anko stated, as she looked to the man, whose eyes suddenly opened looking at her with a look of pleasure. Kimimaro, please don't let them bother me while I gather my chakra into my body. Kimimaro merely nodded and sprung forward. Naru's body barely had time to stand and react as she brought a hand to block his punch. Instead, a white blade slammed into her hand, and a moment later, he spun around and delivered a kick into her stomach that also drew blood upon another white blade that almost clattered to the ground, but was caught by the spinning shinobi, who deftly brought them up to parry Anko's return attack. Naru, on the other hand, was gasping on the ground, tears slowly leaking from her eyes as she tried to force her usual healing, but without the presence of the fox, her healing was slower. While still superior to a normal person's by far, larger wounds took much longer. I could die from this, she panicked as she attempted to move back from the battle before her. Anko was being handled like a schoolgirl by the masterful enemy. Was this the true power of Orochimaru's soldiers? Well, then, I suppose compared to a cage, a special Jonin shouldn't be too much trouble. Kimimaro stated calmly, before he seemed to speed up further, his arms becoming blurs of motion, slicing and stabbing much faster than before. Anko's eyes widened as she was hard-pressed to keep pace with the deadly attacks. Slowly cuts began to appear all over her coat, as the white-haired ninja suddenly fainted, and brought his strike around for a fatal blow. This I cannot allow. As a sandaled foot slammed into Kimimaro, knocking him back, as a green-clad young man stood before him, in an obviously offensive taijutsu stance. Something about him obviously bothered Kimimaro. What are you? He asked, annoyed as he looked almost disgusted at the young shinobi, but quickly became passive again. I am the handsome devil of the Hidden Leaf Village. My name is Rock Lee. Rock Lee smiled and turned to Anko. I have come to help. As he gave her his good guy pose, Kimimaro took the distraction as a K to strike, however was surprised when he struck the ground instead. Rock Lee had moved next to Anko, and she was even impressed a bit with his speed. I see you did not come alone as well, you can come out. Kimimaro stated as he looked into the bushes just behind Naru, who had pushed herself against a nearby tree. A blur suddenly moved towards Kimimaro, who leapt back warily, and watched as the white-haired man landed on one leg, arms spread wide and an almost goofy smile on his face. Ah, you know not who you have challenged. I am the most skilled and handsome of AKK ninja. Capable of bringing women to their knees in worship. Known throughout the world as the Great Sage. Jiraiya. He shouted, happy to have finally gotten off his pose, and looked to Rock Lee and gave him a quick thumbs up before looking back to his foes. Even Rock Lee seemed a bit put off. Lord Orochimaru mentioned you. A Sannin or not, your presence makes no difference. Kimimaro said confidently. Oh, and why do you think that? As he prepared to show the young shinobi why he was so respected. Because, the time limit is up. A dark voice said from behind Kimimaro, and Jiraiya gasped, as he saw the man walking towards them. Now, I will devour your very minds, your spirits, and everything you've ever known and loved. I never thought I'd see you walking again. Togashi of the Eternal Hunger. Jiraiya said darkly as he looked over the pale-skinned shinobi now dressed identically to Kimimaro. Well, things change. Now, shall we dance? Kimimaro and Togashi each shifted into the same stance, and Jiraiya looked to Rock Lee and Anko. Be careful, Togashi was known by another name once as well, Togashi of the Thousand Forms. Before he could continue, they were forced to move. Naru looked on, cursing herself for being so weak. She'd never known she relied so heavily on the fox before. I need to help them. As she slowly rose to her feet, Jiraiya seemed to notice her for the first time, and quickly broke off. Naru, go on, complete the mission, we'll handle this. Think you can handle me? Thousand spears of light. Togashi called as lightning began to crash down in almost random areas, burning the fields as he smiled watching his foes dodge the lightning. Kimimaro quickly moved to Togashi's side, face impassive. Naru, however, was barely standing. How could she? No, it didn't matter. She had to push on. So she slowly brought her hands together and gathered as much chakra as she could around her wound. Heal, 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 she screamed in her mind, as the slow burning feeling of her chakras sealing the wound slowly filled her belly, and she smiled. Quickly tossing off her ruined black armored coat and revealing an orange vest as she slipped past to continue the chase. Think you escaped because we didn't let you? How foolish. Kimimaro muttered as the pair of ninja before him continued to fight together at a pace he was only barely able to match, without having to actually try. Togashi, however, was less than pleased. He'd been left the strongest of the bunch to handle alone. Normally he'd enjoy it, but this was also the man that was able to cripple him before, leaving him a cripple for almost a decade. However, he reasoned, that was long ago. So, of course now things were different. So Jiraiya, how is Su-chan? With that Jiraiya growled and charged forward, and Togashi smiled. Perfect. Shadow of Intent. Disclaimer. I don't own Naruto. Arc 1 Finale. Part 2. Naru stopped as she reached deep into the last bits of forest. Her body was aching as she placed a hand over her stomach, where the seal was etched in her flesh, and let out a slow breath. Sasuke-kun, she muttered before leaping out, landing on the head of the first Hokage's massive statue. She looked across to see Sasuke, standing with his arms crossed as a slim smirk marked his face. The girl that had carried him here was standing further behind her, and looked a bit worried, almost cowering. Sasuke, however, stepped forward. So, this is where we stand. Naru Baka. Sasuke-kun. Why are you doing all of this? Sasuke, however, looked away a bit, his dark eyes looking down into the sea. I've seen what you will do, and the only way to save us is to kill you. Gain the ultimate eye. I would say I am sorry. But I am not, he stated calmly, as he returned to his neutral position. Naru's eyes widened. What? What do you mean? She shouted, clutching at the fabric of her top over her heart. It didn't make any sense. No more talking. Then he made a few quick signs and a fireball as large as the statue's head shot towards Naru. In a blur, Naru leapt down towards the water. However, a blur of blue struck into her, driving a knee into her freshly healed stomach. Blood flew from her lips as she was ground into the wall. Sasuke blinked a bit and pressed his hand into her neck and laughed, as he brought his hand down. Again, and again, and again. Shadow, clone? Sasuke's eyes widened as a pair of clones threw him off of the original, whose face was contorted with bruising and covered in blood, tears falling from her eyes. How had Sasuke moved so far forward? Then he was on her again. The clones lasted only moments as she tried to leap away but instead collapsed, her ribs and body burning in agony. And no, please Sasu, however her voice broke as his foot slammed into her throat. His dark eyes scanned her face, and then he blinked, the red of his Sharingan burning into her eyes. Just die, you useless waste of flesh. And in an instant he moved his foot before he brought a kunai down into her chest, blood splattering both of their faces as he looked up into her face. Her breathing was weak and frantic as she tried to recover. He brought it down again, and a third time to be sure. Please, just die, save the world with your blood? Saw Sasuke, his voice was like a wisp on the wind, as she shivered slowly. I always However, her words were cut off by painful coughs. Her hand brushed his cheek and he leapt away, eyes wide. He could only watch as her life ebbed away. Mindscape. Naru's eyes weakly opened, as her breathing was still harsh and slow. She was dying, slowly. Blood filling her lungs, as she noticed a pair of weak, tired eyes looking down at her. Fox? She murmured as the fox nodded, but it seemed weakened and slowly lay down to rest. You must live, so I can kill you, the exhausted voice grumbled, but none of its chakra flowed out. Instead, the massive fox seemed to disappear from its cage. You want to live? Suddenly Naru's pain was gone, and she was kneeling before another place. A doorway, not marked in any way except for a single letter. N. Why yes. She gasped as she closed her eyes. Something was wrong. Her head was burning, like the worst migraine ever, mixed with a stabbing feeling, along with her swimming vision. I can give you the power to live. I can save you. The voice continued. How? Open the door. Naru's face contorted in suspicion until she threw up blood. Her mind seemed to be blurring away as she looked up at the door. See, can you save me? Yes, I will save you. Free if you open the door, able to help you. Her hearing was slowly dissolving as her body weakened further. Who are you? The voice chuckled and then she felt her resolve harden. With all of her strength she yelled, Tell me, she hacked covering her mouth. Your lost brother. Naru's eyes widened as she tried to remember a brother, but the pain was rising again. In a fit of desperation she flung the door open, it was the only way. A grim chuckle flowed from the doorway as a bright light filled her mindscape, and she screamed as a flood of red chakra consumed her. Valley of the End. Sasuke blinked as he rubbed his head. Something told him that he had been too slow. That he had failed. He spun to look at Naru and gasped as she was consumed by red chakra. She seemed to float before she slammed onto all fours, and a pair of red tails swished dangerous behind her. Sasuke-sama, run! Tayuya shouted from her perch, shaking in fear, holding her head in pain. She too was experiencing the migraines. Sasuke however only smirked as he recomposed himself and looked over at Naru, before he blurred forward, like a bolt of black and blue. He spun around and delivered a powerful kick to her side, and smirked as she went flying. However, the chakra that cloaked her seemed to stick to his ankle before literally slamming him into the wall, 1, 2, 3 times. Using him like a brake to slow down, landing on the wall like it was the floor. Sasuke, I will destroy you, you traitor! Naru roared, running along the wall, like an animal. Her rage wouldn't be sated, she needed to get back at him. The moment passed as he leapt from the hole and evaded Naru with the obvious grace of a warrior using the power of a dujutsu. He calmly moved, only dodging with the most necessary of motions, ducking under even the strikes from her chakra, seemed to be nothing more than pillars for him to dance around. Then he stopped and brought a knee up, disorienting the raging blonde for a moment. Then she was caught in a roar of fire that was strong enough to throw Sasuke into the wall on the opposite side of the valley. You traitorous bastard, I'll kill you. Sasuke however burst out of the wall, a dangerous look on his face. You don't know the meaning of the word. Naru. As she leapt up towards Sasuke, he flashed through the hand seals and smirked, as lighting burst through the air. Chidori. And the water was splashed with red, as the scream of 1,000 birds ripped the silence away, and slammed through Naru's chakra cloak, as his screams echoed even louder than those of the woman before him. Nearby clearing. Anko and Rock Lee were back to back as they awaited the next appearance of their opponent who had taken to burrowing under the ground, popping up to attack, and then disappearing again with blinding speed. Rock Lee was exhausted. Anko growled angrily as Kimimaro stood before them, the cursed active to the first level, and shaking his head a bit, if you beg. I might let you run. He stated simply. However, his confidence melted away a moment later, as he looked behind himself, eyes wide in terror. All of the combatants had stopped to stare at the spire of red that had bled into the sky, and the wash of power rolled over them. Jiraiya and Togashi looked to one another before they continued, having experienced something similar in their long lives, but even they couldn't ignore the force of that killing intent entirely. However, Rock Lee, Anko, and even Kimimaro were floored as they struggled against the force. What is this? Kimimaro growled, and Rock Lee looked to the worried face of Anko, and instantly knew one thing. Their companion was over there, as they slowly regained themselves. Rock Lee prayed for her safety, before they continued to fight the deadly Kimimaro. However, all around them, the animals fled away from the Pillar of Red, all knowing what it meant by nature alone. Somewhere nearby a village madman began raving and shouting. And all over the world those 8 other forces took notice, no matter how subconsciously, something had changed. Valley of the End. Sasuke smiled as he washed his hand in the water, not wanting her blood on him. However, the Pillar of Red was troubling him. She had been struck in the chest. An instant kill. So it couldn't be that, so what was it? Sasuke feared he didn't want to know the answer as he watched Naru's chest slowly closing and he gasped. No, you don't. His body moved like a blur and slammed onto her, choking the weak breath from her body. His hands shaking, eyes burning into her dead stare. Sasuke growled as he could feel his skin burning under the assault of the red chakra on his arms, but he didn't stop. Die, die, die? As he brought his hand up and prepared to run another Chidori through her, however, instead he gripped his head in pain and screamed as something seemed to stab into his mind. Ah, he shouted as he threw himself from the near-dead girl. His eyes black and shaking from side to side in fear. Idiot Tilda, you should have ran, Sasuke-chan. However, I am a good sport. I'll let you run now, a dark, but playful voice growled as Sasuke stood and frowned. His body was in agony already, burns and cuts. Bones had probably been broken as well. Unless the mighty Uchiha wishes to face an opponent as strong as his brother. Sasuke's eyes widened and then he smiled viciously. This specter had said the wrong words to him. Show yourself. I am not afraid of you. Oh, you shouldn't lie, Sasuke-chan. You see, no one isn't afraid of me. Sasuke snarled, about to respond as he noticed something floating in the chakra flowing into the sky. Expecting an attack, he bounced back and looked at it. Instead, he saw a skeleton floating above Naru's body, arms spread wide. Slowly the skeleton began to grow flesh, slowly at first, but it quickly began to speed up. Sasuke blinked and growled louder before firing off another powerful Kaiden jutsu. Fireball? Really now? How childish. If you want to see fire. Sasuke's eyes widened as his jutsu suddenly disappeared and then skeleton moved through a jutsu, its head and hands still skinless. Then with a roar a massive spout of fire spilled out from the being. Sasuke quickly dived into the water and swam to the other side of the river from the thing. Once he was on land, he looked over to see the end result of the red chakra dying out. A single cord of red was all that connected Naru to this man. He looked so much like her, that Sasuke would have to say he was like a male version of Naru. However, when his gaze moved to Sasuke, the young genius knew he had to run. He had to escape. As he fled up the wall towards the head of Madara, he stopped, eyes wide as he noticed the blonde man walking towards him calmly. Sorry, your chance was up when you attacked me. He was obviously using the same power Naru had as well. Don't worry, I'll make your death fast. Traitor-kun. Then he held his hands out in front of himself, palms facing Sasuke, as a massive amount of chakra was gathered there. I call this one, Red Lightning. I hope you can survive this, to see more of my power, Traitor-kun tilde. And Sasuke closed his eyes by reaction alone as the flare blazed towards him. If this kind of power was what his brother had, he never had a chance. However, Sasuke heard the explosion and felt the ground shake, but it seemed so far away, as his face was sprinkled with water. Sasuke-kun, wake up, Naru's weak voice called, and he slowly opened his eyes to see the again blue eyes of his ex-teammate looking down at him. He was on the top of the valley walls on the other side from Konoha. He was alive because of her. Run, Sasuke-kun, you can't die, I need to save you. Then she collapsed into unconsciousness, and Sasuke was at a loss. He'd never expected her to save him like that. Soon the red-haired Sound Kunoichi was pulling him along, and together they fled for Sound. Stupid child, well, I suppose I can entertain myself with the others. The man calmly touched Naru. Her wounds seemed to knit together faster with his contact. His eyes softened as he did and slowly he smiled. We can't afford to be so foolish, Naru. We can't let him live. Then they were gone in a flash of red light. Forest clearing. It was like the sky had suddenly burst into fire, a sky of burning red. The Konoha shinobi had regrouped as the Sound did the same. A girl fell in front of them first, obviously injured as the rift in the sky seemed to grow for a moment before bursting in a shockwave of energy. A blonde-haired boy landed in front of the group with a lazy smile, his features sharp, an aura of red surrounding him. Anko and Rock Lee noticed the Konoha headband immediately, but it was Jiraiya who recognized the ninja first, tears of joy and surprise lighting up his face for a moment before he wiped them away. Naruto! Jiraiya shouted and moved to stand with the young blonde. Stay back, Ero Sennin, I will take care of them. Naruto's eyes were locked on Togashi. He didn't remember a man like him. Jiraiya however seemed shocked by Naruto's confidence, and was prepared to tell him he was outclassed. Until he felt the power of his chakra as it flowed out. A roar filled the air as his chakra seemed to burn the grass at his feet. Togashi however, smiled widely before shaking his head. Kimimaro-kun, it is time to retreat. They have reinforcements now. As Kimimaro noted the rest of the recovery squad arriving, and Togashi nodded. Kimimaro spun and ran as Togashi opened his palms, and quickly a mouth appeared on each palm. Twin soul summoning. Then the mouth spit up blood, making a pair of summoning circles. In a massive puff of smoke, that once cleared a pair of people wearing masks, had appeared. Togashi on the other hand had disappeared. Boring. He's a soul eater, eh? Oh well, I can handle this. Then he growled as a quartet of tails appeared around himself, concentrating around his hands, as chakra began to gather there. Red lightning. Then a flash of light like a miniature sun was lit from his hands, and when the light died away, their forest in front of them was wasteland and nothing seemed to be left of the pair, and slowly the glow died away. Good to see you, Ero Sennin. However, the toad sage was frowning as he walked towards his returned student. He still noted. Naru was still here. Something was wrong. He would find out what. 1 week later, Konoha Anbu cells. The Hokage of Konoha walked down to the holding cells with the pair of people that the Hokage trusted most. The most easily recognized was the burly shape of Jiraiya, as they looked through the glass of the cell to see the calm visage of Naruto Uzumaki, meditating on the floor of his cell. On the bed next to him was the silent, resting form of Naru Uzumaki. I know it sounds impossible, but I clearly remember training that boy, and the girl as well. I think the time-space disruption theory. It would make sense. I am not doubting this. However, his power and intentions are unknown to us. Hokage-sama, with all due respect, you just returned from a battlefield. I think you should settle down and try to take measure of these events. I know enough. That boy is related to the problem. I want to know how. The trio looked back to the room, and were all shocked to see the room missing one occupant, and turned as a voice coughed. Ah, Hokage-sama, it is a pleasure to meet you face to face. I am Naruto Uzumaki. The Hokage frowned as the trio looked over the boy, and Jiraiya was the first to speak. Are you the same Naruto I trained? Yes. Jiraiya smiled brightly before he was cut short, but the boy, and no. You see, that is the residual effect of the jutsu that brought me here. Time dilation, my memories, my will imposed itself on the world to give me a place here. Unluckily most of the effects will wear off and I will be a man with no history here. It's the cost of fleeing a dying world. The pair of advisors nodded and the Hokage spoke calmly. Obviously then you're using a powerful kenjutsu. One that allowed you to exist. I don't exactly understand how it works, and doubt I want to. However, if you swear fealty to me, and promise to help us as well. Some things can be overlooked. Naruto smiled a bright and friendly smile that made the trio a bit worried. His expression seemed off. Don't worry, I am like Naru's brother. I won't let anything bad happen. He smirked a bit more before saying, so, Hokage-sama, Jiraiya-sama, and temporary Hokage Tsunade-sama, what do you say? Can I be a Konoha ninja? The Hokage looked the boy over and frowned deeply before he removed his hat and smiled. Yes, we will do some tests later, but, for now, welcome home. Naruto-san, thank you, Yandaime-sama.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.